This is Monica Perez here with Ernst van Sale. He's from South Africa. He was recommended to us by Gabriel Custodiet, who is a good friend of the show from Watchman's Privacy. I've been, we've all kind of seen in the news stuff about South Africa because of Trump's comments. There's propaganda, there's counter propaganda. And I thought it would be great to talk to somebody on the ground, an activist who knows what's really going on. We're just interested in the real facts, no spin here. And thank you, Ernst, for being here and being willing to tell us all about what is happening from your perspective and a little bit about the history of South Africa and kind of where you fall into the context as what I think somebody who was born maybe the first generation after apartheid ended.
Well, good evening, Monica. Thank you very much for the invite. Yes, South Africa is my speciality. I mean, I can answer any question that you want. About South Africa, the only questions that I can't answer are the ones that I genuinely just don't have the answer or the knowledge for, the facts for, the stats for. But any question that I don't have, for example, if the stats at hand, I can always refer your audience to the relevant source where they can find it for themselves. But at the same time, when it comes to particularly South Africa, it's not a country that's for beginners. It's really a complex place. It's incredibly difficult to make heads or tails about what's going on here politically, culturally. And I just want to put this little footnote there. South Africans in general don't expect Americans to be experts on South Africa. We're not the center of the world. We're not a country that's constantly talked about or in the news. We are now at the moment, a light is being shone on us the past 2 months. But in general, South Africa is kind of there on the periphery of people's attention. So I just want to reassure your audience, just because they can't list like a massive bullet point list of all the facts about South Africa, it doesn't mean that they are uninformed or that they're stupid. It just means that South Africa doesn't really feature all that often in people's minds, and for good reasons. South Africa is not one of the great powers in the world. But I'll try my best to shine a light on what's going on here, past, present, future, and I hope I can give your audience a bit of a more clear view of what's going on here.
We probably know the highlights of South Africa. It has a very interesting history. It has elements of colonialism. We still think of South Africa, Americans like me who are trying to understand the deeper truth about the nature of power in the world. We think of the Five Eyes countries. We think of the US or Canada, UK, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa as that kind of ring around Eurasia that is a remnant or still the network of the British Empire. But I do think people do get a little fuzzy on, when the Dutch came to South Africa, when the British kind of pushed them out. We talk a lot about, or what's in the news right now is white South Africans. And I don't think people really understand about Afrikaners and the history of the native populations there, or who was responsible for apartheid, who benefited from it. So, but I think it does make sense to kind of go back to the beginning of when there were white settlers in South Africa, who was already there, and just the highlights. I know you know everything about, you know so much about your own history. I would love to pick your brain in great detail. Today, I do want to just do the highlights so that we can talk about the political issues that are in our newspapers. So I really appreciate you doing this.
Absolutely. So I'll just set the table then for the larger conversation about the present in South Africa. So, I mean, again, disclaimer, it's a fascinating, complex history, a lot of details, but I'm going to be very seriously condensing it. So I just want to get that out of the way. Often people say, why didn't you mention this? Why didn't you mention this? Well, I'm going to need hours upon hours to mention everything, but I'll give you, as you said, I'll give you the highlights. So South Africa as a country is not a very old institution or entity. South Africa that you know today only really was formed in 1910 with the Union of South Africa. In regards to the first European settlement in South Africa, that was in 1652. So that was when the Dutch East India Company set up a refreshment station here at the southern tip of Africa for all the ships that were on their way to India and other places across the Indian Ocean. And that's a long journey. That's months upon months. It's on a rickety wooden ship. I personally would not want to be in that situation. But you start running low on supplies about when you get around the tip of Africa, the southern tip. So then that's why they needed a refreshment station for fresh fruits and meat and vegetables and to replenish those ships. So again, it's not a massive colony that they're starting. It's starting a tiny little refreshment station of about between 50 and 80 sailors, setting it up, a little tiny little settlement. The next important date, I think, just for perspective, is around 1754. So a census of the Cape settlement says that 100 years after the first arrival, only about 510 people are living there. So again, not a bustling, massive colony, tiny little refreshment station at the southern tip of Africa. The next important date is 1770, because this is the first contact between white settlers and the ancestors of Black South Africans. So, and again, the ancestors of Black South Africans that are encountered here are just one of the many different Black tribes that are here in South Africa, in Southern Africa at this moment. But at the same time, Southern Africa is almost the size of Europe, the continent of Europe, which means that just because the ancestors of Black South Africans are living in one part of Southern Africa does not mean that they are living all across what you know as Southern Africa or South Africa today. It's a massive country. So, and this fact kind of gives you that perspective. So when the Dutch settlers arrived for the first time at the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, they encountered natives there, the Khoi and the San, who are nomadic peoples with Stone Age technology, but they have no relation to the ancestors of Black South Africans. These Khoi and San, these nomadic tribes, are a completely different people on their own. Their descendants today are the colored South Africans. It's not a slur. It's not some slang term. It is an official term for an ethnicity, a unique ethnicity and culture in South Africa of predominantly the descendants of the Khoi and San, those nomadic tribes that the Dutch encountered primarily for the first time when they arrived here. But that was in 1652. The first time that the Dutch settlers encountered the ancestors of Black South Africans was only more than 100 years later, 118 years after landing in South Africa at the Fish River, about 1,000 kilometers from the Cape settlement. That's about 500 miles of distance that they had to travel before they met the first Black Africans. When it comes to particularly why this fact is important, is that the political elite in South Africa are Black South Africans. They make up the political elite in South Africa, and their claim is staking a claim to all of the land in what we call South Africa today. But that's simply not true. If you Google, for example, Black population map of South Africa, you'll see where the majority of Black South Africans live. They all are concentrated in the northern half of the country, and then the southern or the western half is just empty. Why is that? Because at a certain point, you can't maintain a massive settlement without borehole technology, and that's where this line almost goes through South Africa.
It's just because of the water.
It's a very arid country. If your audience wants a little bit of perspective, they can go on Google Earth or satellite imagery and just look at South Africa. It looks like the surface of Mars, large parts of it, and you can't farm there without a borehole in large scale. So, and like I said, this encounter is very important because those descendants, the modern day Black elite of South Africa, claim ownership or say that the whole of South Africa was populated by their ancestors. That's simply not true. As I said, the first encounter between their ancestors and the Afrikaner ancestors or white South African ancestors was only 118 years after the first Dutch settlement here, 500 kilometers from where they first landed. The next important date is, 1799, the Dutch East India Company formally dissolves. And then by 1806, the British Empire annex this little refreshment station, the settlement, turning it into more of what you would now recognize as a colony, because now it's being incorporated into the British Empire. And This is around the time of so this is just a few years after your country's founding in 1776. So just for a little bit of context there, it's about
It's interesting.
25 years. It's
Yeah,
about 30 years
because
after, exactly 30 years after that. Yeah.
yeah, because the colonization era, which of course is also our history,
Hmm.
I mean, it's in a certain span of time when that's
Mm,
happening. So
right.
that's the context. That's the world's
Mm,
historical context of when this is
exactly.
happening.
So why is this important? Well, the British annexing the Cape means that now the descendants of Dutch and French Huguenots, a lot of French
Oh,
Huguenots also fled to South
right.
Africa, fleeing religious persecution in Europe. So, I mean, a lot of my ancestors are French Huguenots,
Oh,
which means that now these descendants of the French Huguenots and the Dutch settlers are being treated as second-class citizens in the Cape Colony, in the British colony, meaning that, well, firstly, the entire legal system is abolished and replaced with the British legal system. The language that the state and any authority from the state is talking and communicating with them is in English. All their schools are being anglicized. They
wow.
are being treated as inferior, talked about as inferior, not as civilized or sophisticated as the British. And this all comes to a boiling point around 1838,
Excuse
where
me. Let me
these.
just ask you a quick
Yes,
question.
go for it.
During that period, say 1806 to
Mm,
1838, do you so there's the Dutch population, the
mm,
French population, the
mm,
English population.
mm.
What is the black or colored population at that time?
Yeah, that's one of those things where I don't have the stats now at
Yeah.
hand.
What's your
Yeah,
impression though?
it's going to be
Was
a
it
bit
that
difficult to really gauge it,
but did
but you
y'all
can.
carve out a
Mhm,
space that wasn't really occupied or was nomadic, or were
mm,
you competing with displacing
mm,
farmers or from the native
mm.
population? Do you happen to have
Well,
an
there was
impression of that?
definitely, I mean, it wasn't a peaceful affair. There was a lot of conflict going on, but a lot of trade and agreements as well. The thing about nomadic tribes is they're not really settled anywhere. They're moving about in a very large area. So there is a lot of open land, a lot of places that's just not settled. But that's the nature of nomadic tribes.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, so yeah, and as I said, the ancestors of Black South Africans are 1,000 kilometers away from
Got
where
it.
the happening
Yes.
that I'm describing now. So what's happening?
Got
What
it. I understand now.
happens
Yeah.
next? So these are the ancestors of the Boers, the French and the Dutch settlers. They later German settlers also come, which
Yes.
also form part of the Boer uh, genetic makeup. And in 1838, the Great Trek happens, where these proto Boers, they're not Boers yet. They're known as free burgers, Vryburgers, free citizens. And at that point, they've just had enough. So they've had enough of the British dictating to them what to do, how they should be conducting themselves. They've had enough of being second-class citizens. They've had enough of their children being anglicized, their culture and identity being threatened. There's a lot of British propaganda during this time that the Great Trek happened because slavery was abolished, but that doesn't really hold up when you look at what's happening here. A lot of these Boers that go on the Great Trek, they're not poor. They are actually quite affluent, and they're leaving all of their earthly possessions behind. They're only taking with them what they can fit into a tiny little ox wagon. They're leaving their farms behind. They're leaving most of their possessions behind. This is not something you do just because you can't keep slaves anymore. This is something you do because you are being existentially threatened. Your very existence is being threatened, your culture's existence, your identity's existence. So they start trekking into the interior. Very something I think Americans also appreciate, that idea of, well, if you guys are going to treat us this way, we're just going to go this direction. We're just going to go into the unknown, far away from where we're not being oppressed and living under the thumb of the British Empire. So they trek into the unknown. They have no idea what they're going to encounter, and that's the Great Trek. And they very, again, fascinating long story
Yeah.
short, as they go into the interior, they encounter more of the ancestors of Black South Africans, a lot of Black African tribes. And this comes now down to your question: how was land acquired? Well, land was acquired in three ways. Firstly, it was acquired through treaties and agreements, trade. Secondly, there was a lot of empty land that was just not settled, because, again, like I said, Southern Africa is the size of Europe, and it's currently populated by maybe a few million people living on a continent-sized landmass. Of course, there's going to be a lot of open land that nobody is living on. So that's the second way. And the third way is through conquest. There is a lot of conflict. There is land being conquered and taken. But there's a lot of nuance. There's these three different ways that land is being taken. The political zeitgeist today just focuses on the on the one way of it was all conquest. No, that's not true. That's a lie. That's that's definitely not what happened. So when it comes to now, the Great Trek happens again, massive complex history condensed to the point where then they found two Boer republics. So they found a lot of Boer republics, but two main ones, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal Republic, or the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, the ZAR. These two Boer republics exist for a few decades, and then they find diamonds and gold, which means that the pesky Eye of Sauron, the imperial attention comes.
What year was that?
Comes unmissable. That's between 18. So that's somewhere between 1840 and 1880. So in that 30 to 40 year period that happens, that's when the Boer republics existed. So now the first Anglo-Boer War breaks out. The Boers win that first Anglo-Boer War. Then there is a peace until 1899 when the second Anglo-Boer War breaks out, which is the more famous one. Here, the British budgeted for a 3-month war. It ended up lasting 3 years, almost bankrupting the entire empire. A lot of new technology and ways of warfare are introduced and invented here that are then carried into almost like a foreshadowing of the 20th century. A lot of the things you see in the First World War come from the Anglo-Boer War. Mass use of trench warfare, total modernization of the British army, military, and then also guerrilla warfare, because now for the first time the British Empire is fighting against a guerrilla warfare insurgency force, because they've captured within the first year the two Boer Republic capitals, Bloemfontein and Pretoria, and then the Boers are just like, well, the British are like, well, we've captured your capitals. Those are the rules. Checkmate. End of the game. And then the Boers are like, we're not playing chess. We're not going to be giving up, even if you have captured our capitals. Which means that now they go into guerrilla warfare.
Well, they were farmers, right? So
yeah,
these people are people who are connected to the land,
very close to the same technology that you see during your own revolution.
Okay, because if you're merchants and you're kingdoms and stuff, and you're fighting. If that's the economic center and you conquer it, you probably have the advantage. But if the power is with the people attached to the land, they have to capitulate potentially one by one.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I just misspoke. They're not technologically the same, but the type of force is the very organized, centralized, powerful empire versus basically a ragtag force of farmers. Yes. The technology has advanced quite a bit in that time between your revolution, 1899.
I never even think of the Revolutionary War, in any. I never think of it as like
the American Revolutionary War actually had a lot of influence on Afrikaner thinking. They saw it as something that as something noble, as something that they admired.
And we did have that Dutch colonial history, but that's not. I don't believe that's what. I mean, all the revolutionaries that I ever learned about were of English descent.
Right. So then the second Anglo-Boer War, now it's dragging on for years. The British Empire is being pushed to bankruptcy. They're becoming the laughing stock of Europe because they're losing against a bunch of farmers, and or they can't win against a bunch of farmers. And then they go full scorched earth tactics, which means that you see the first concentration camps being used. It's not, concentration camps weren't invented in the Second World War by the Germans. They were first used in mass by the British in the Second Anglo-Boer War, which means that now, firstly, the scorched earth policy means they are burning down every single Boer farm that there is. They're taking all the women and children and putting them into concentration camps, killing all of the livestock, destroying all of the crops. They're pretty much going full scorched earth, destroying everything that they can to make the Boers give up. Because, I mean, if your women and children are dying in a concentration camp, your farms are destroyed, I mean, what are you still fighting for? So then in the end, that forces the Boers to surrender in 1902, which leaves a very bloody legacy. The fact that more women and children died in those concentration camps than soldiers on both sides combined.
Ugh.
That's the reality of that war. Now the 20th century starts.
How old? When was Winston Churchill born?
Winston Churchill was actually a combatant in the Anglo-Boer War as a very young man.
He was there. I'm not sure.
He was there, yeah.
I'm not
he
sure
was
he was
captured
in
by
any
the Boers,
danger.
yeah, and then he escaped. That gave him a lot of his fame,
rescued.
yeah.
I think he was rescued. His story is totally
Gandhi was also there. Gandhi was also he was
a British lawyer.
He was a stretcher carrier for a British one of the British units.
Interesting. And there's the Indian one. I noticed that in the race laws in South Africa right now, there's four racial
distinct official groups. So it's the Indians, coloreds, black, and white.
So that must mean that the Indians have a historical position there. That's not a new thing.
Yeah, no, the Indians in South Africa, the Indian population has been here for a very long time.
As old as the English colonial relationship.
Yeah, as old as the port of Natal in KwaZulu-Natal, yes. So it's not, I don't think it's not as old as the early 1800s, but definitely second half of the 1800s is, if I remember correctly, I'm talking under correction, is when they imported a lot of Indian slaves, the British Empire, to farm the sugarcane on the East Coast. So that now we're entering the 20th century. Again, a lot of fascinating stuff that I'm going to have to condense. But now huge drama comes in, because now just a few years later, South Africa, so firstly 1910, South Africa becomes a country. It's united under the Union of South Africa, becoming pretty much what you know as South Africa today. Before that, it was just a region. Before that, it was the Cape Colony, the Boer republics, and many traditional native areas where the native chiefs and kingdoms were. So now the 20th century rolls in, and just a few years later, South Africa is now a British dominion. Now First World War starts, and now the controversy comes in, because now South Africa is going to fight on Britain's side in the First World War. These Boers and their descendants now have to fight on the side of the empire that just defeated them in that brutal war, put their family members in concentration camps, against a country, Germany, which supported the Boers in the Anglo-Boer War. So it completely it tears the Afrikaner community in two, because now there's this massive raging debate of how can we fight on the English side in this war. It becomes so heated that in 1914 there is what we informally call the Afrikaner Civil War, where there's just a massive revolt among Afrikaners regarding specifically, primarily, the fighting on the side of Britain in the First World War. So now fast forward a little bit more. Firstly, after the scorched earth policies, for the first almost 50 years of the 20th century, Afrikaners are incredibly impoverished. They have lost everything. They don't have any of their farms left. They have no possessions left, and they just lost the brutal war where almost a third of their population was wiped out. So this whole white privilege narrative of you've been building up wealth for hundreds of years, like, there's no such thing happening here. It was all, whatever had been built up had just been wiped out completely.
Oh, interesting. And I also noticed they make a distinction. Your race laws do make a distinction between black, colored, Indian, and I think I heard Chinese can count as black.
Yeah, Chinese can't count as black, but and then there's white.
There's no distinction between
no.
the Afrikaner and the English white people, which have a very strong difference as far as economic
ideologically,
history.
Economically, the difference in the first half of the 20th century is incredibly large. I think by the 1940s still, Afrikaners only controlled about 1% of South African industry. The rest was controlled by the English population. So, and the mining magnates specifically. So mining, everything in South Africa in the 20th century specifically revolves around mining. It's the major...
And that's definitely British. That's Cecil Rhodes. I mean, that was intentional. That was the whole point of all of it. Okay.
South Africa, pretty much the existence of South Africa at that time is to get minerals out of the ground and ship it overseas. That's like the the reason that South Africa, to put it very simply, that's the entity of the unit, the United South Africa, is to get gold and diamonds out of the ground, specifically gold. And so then Second World War rolls in. Also, again, a lot of controversy in regards to fight. Now, again, we're going to fight on the side of Britain. Already, this has been an unresolved cleavage among Afrikaners, and that then leads up to these frustrations boiling over to 1948, when the National Party and Afrikaner Party wins, and that's the party that institutes apartheid between 1948 and 1994. That's the official timeline, but apartheid as a system only really started kicking in the 1950s and had already begun starting to be seriously reformed by the 1980s. So
you said apartheid was established in 1948?
Yeah.
And that was, what was that? What was, and maybe it didn't kick into the 50s, but what was the definition of that exactly? Was it the same thing? Just, was it white and non-white? Did it have sub-distinctions like they do
it had
now?
the Population Registration Act, which registered people based on those four groups that
those
mentioned.
four groups. Okay.
Right. So, yeah, and then you have the segregation, racial segregation, specifically. So what's happening here, and again, major complex history being condensed into like a tiny little footnote, but you've got a split within the ruling party. Again, on the one side, you have the idealists, the people that are genuinely looking to create like little republics for every culture that there is, because the Afrikaners have always wanted their own republic. That's been like the central mission among Afrikaners for hundreds of years. And those idealists are arguing that we want to give what we've always wanted to all the other groups in South Africa. That's their mission. Whether it's practical or whether it's moral, that's a whole different debate. On the other side, you have the cynical, just like, we have a massive population of cheap black labor. We have a lot of gold that we want to extract from the ground. We're going to build a system to use a system directed at exploiting cheap black labor to industrialize South Africa and to pretty much keep the mines going.
See, that when I think of the Americas and their colonial history, I think the English, the way they did it, seems to me, but I'm just a hack trying to figure stuff out. But it seems to me that they sent English colonizers over. They had at least the promise of, the expectation of representative government, of communication with the country, with the motherland. Whereas in South America, it seems to me that the Spanish set up counties. They put counts there, and they use the native population for however they wanted to use that land. And I always thought that was very different, but it sounds I thought it was a philosophical difference that coincided with the different countries' colonizing style. But it sounds like the way the English dealt with South Africa was they did exploit the native population. Maybe Native Americans.
No, well, I would say the entire 20th century is just the exploitation of cheap labor, whether that cheap labor be Afrikaner labor. After the Anglo-Boer War, Afrikaners were also working in the mines because they were also destitute, but also the exploitation of black labor for the majority of for the entirety of the 20th century. That's the economic engine or the economic fuel that's being used to pretty much keep the mines going. And as I say, the entire economy for this entire century is just revolving around mining.
And it's not
the technology. It's not modern technology. So not everything is mechanized. It's still you're sending hordes of people underground to like manual labor get this gold out of the earth.
Is that still going on? Like, how is that? How do they deal?
Well, there is still a very large mining industry in South Africa, but it is increasingly being mechanized.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So
that's
probably why slavery ended in the rest of the world.
Version of the 20th century. And 1994, we have a mass democracy in South Africa. The entire population votes. ANC wins, and the ANC then remains the one-party state ruling party until 2024, when they lose their majority support, but they go into coalition with other governments, so they're still technically in power, still getting everything that they want. That's a whole conversation on its own. But yeah, that's the end of the 20th century, and then I'm born in the 1990s after apartheid. My own personal story is I'm the ninth generation of my family in Southern Africa. So my first ancestor came here in 1688, a French Huguenot.
Interesting. I was wondering why you had brown eyes. But the French
No,
Huguenot
the
explains it.
hazel. I think hazel is the technical term.
Oh, okay.
But
Okay.
yeah, it's yeah.
I just
My
didn't
ancestors are
associate that with the Teutonic Dutch. I thought, where did that come from? But the French.
yeah. So my whole family history is predominantly a mixture between German, Dutch, French, and a little bit of Scottish, and also Belgian.
So ninth generation.
Ninth generation.
Is that 180? You know, are we talking 1850? Your people came over around the same time as
1688.
1688. 9 generations.
Mm.
All right, those are some. I think I would count that as more than 9 generations.
Yeah, no, it's
you're talking about 9 actual like actual.
Yeah.
You can count 9 people.
Yeah,
okay.
Not like Gen Z, Gen X, Gen
9
Gen
times
Alpha,
180.
Yeah.
Okay, so wow. So you were from those original.
It's
the
like
there to
it's very
serve.
equivalent to in America. You call it Mayflower. The people are Mayflower.
But it doesn't. You know, the Mayflower people. They ended up actually being. You know, it's weird to me because the Mayflower families are like rich, old money families here. And in my mind, when you came over, kind of pushed out of England, how did you, was it really that you just carved it out of the land, or did they have these advantages? But it sounds to me like the way people were coming over in 1688 to work, I guess, to be a merchant.
A lot of manual laborers. I mean, my ancestors weren't highly educated. My initial ancestor, for example, weren't highly educated people. He was the main farmer at the castle there.
Got it. Okay.
So
when did Nelson Mandela? He got out of jail and he took. He was the first president
in 1995.
Right. Okay.
After the elections in 1994. Yes.
Okay. So I remember that, and I was working with a young woman.
He became the president in 1994. Sorry, the elections were in 1994. The interim constitution was 1995, and then the new constitution was in 1996.
Okay. Now, what she had, my South African coworker said at the time, like, it's very tribal. It's very tribal in South Africa. She said the way it's reported here, it's black versus white, but in South Africa, there are many more factions than just that.
So in regards to South Africa, everything is very much defined by culture and language. So culture and language are very close in South Africa. It's not black versus white. The white population is split up between Afrikaners, British descendant, English white South Africans, Greeks, Portuguese, a lot of Portuguese in South Africa. And then we have the colored population, who is a completely different ethnicity on their own. And then, of course, you have the black population, which is also not just one united bloc. South Africa has 11 official languages. So this black South African bloc is filled with Vendas, Chongas, Zulus, Xhosas, almost a dozen different languages and cultures, and they all have their own unique histories.
Okay, so who's in power? When I watched some of your documentaries, or it's a documentary with different interviews, clips, it was the political clips that you showed. It seems there's there's large crowds of people, a lot of getting people in a frenzy. Like, it seems that the political situation is emotional. It doesn't look super legitimate. And I'm just asking, like, who is in power there, really? And there's a lot of race-based laws that
Right. So there's a lot of political parties in South Africa. There's about 48 political parties contesting in the election.
okay.
So there's a lot of variety. There's a few main
So they're
ones. So the
competing with each other.
ANC, Nelson Mandela's party, were in charge from 1994, exclusively in charge. So they had the majority support. They were the one-party state ruling party from 1994 till 2004. So they had 30 years at the helm where they could do whatever they want. And then the second largest party is the Democratic Alliance, which is ideologically they're very close to the Democrats in the United States, but in South Africa, relatively to the ANC, they're not as far left. But in America, their policies line up mostly with the Democrats. And then the third largest party is the MK party, and who are a radical revolutionary party. And then also the EFF, which is the fourth largest party. They used to be the third largest party, but then they lost some support in the previous election. The EFF are the ones dressed in red that chant about kill the boer, kill the farmer. Julius Malema is their leader. He has said many atrocious, horrific things, incited violence against minorities with impunity, no consequences. He is the main chanter of kill the boer, kill the farmer. That's him that you see in that clip where he chants with 100,000 of his supporters in a stadium about 2 years ago, chanting kill the boer, kill the farmer. And he insists it's all metaphorical. But I mean, it's clear as day. It's incitement of violence.
And so now I was just trying to understand where that style was coming from, but they're competing. He's competing against other parties.
Right. He's competing against other parties in a field that is completely saturated with left-wing parties, which means they're all trying to out-left each other.
Right. So he's going to, well, I don't want to skip ahead, but that makes me think of the expropriation law, which I'd like to talk about, which is it's selective communism. It seems like race-based communism. You can talk about any laws you want, any of the political parties, but can we talk a little bit about the expropriation law? This is something
absolutely.
I think you said it wasn't easy to get passed, and it was ultimately kind of ramrodded.
This is why our documentary is called "Is Trump Right About South Africa?" Because his whole statement was very bad things are happening in South Africa. Well, let's look at some of those bad things. Well, firstly, as you correctly pointed out earlier, South Africa has many race laws. South Africa has over 140 race laws currently on the books, many of them explicitly racially discriminatory, as in keeping people out of jobs, keeping people from promotions, keeping people out of sports teams based on the color of their skin. And
including kids, I noticed.
Yeah, that's all documented in our documentary. And yeah, these laws have existed for 30 years now. They've existed for decades. And South Africa is not a non-racial society. South Africa is a deeply racialized society thanks to the race obsession and race madness of the ruling party, the ANC. Now, technically, as I said, from 2024 till now, they've been ruling as a coalition with the Democratic Alliance and other parties in the coalition. But the ANC have de facto pretty much still remained in power. They still get everything they want. They still get all the policies pushed through that they've been tabling. They've not been challenged anywhere in regards to policies being stopped. But that's the one key point of contention, or the point that I think where Trump is shining a light on something very important, is the race laws in South Africa, the racially discriminatory legislation. Then there is the Expropriation Act, as you mentioned. Now, the Expropriation Act also has a long history, but I'll condense that as well in regards to what's going on here. So the first time where the ANC really tried to threaten private property rights in South Africa was around 2018, when they announced that they're going to amend the South African Constitution to alter the Section 25 of the Constitution, which is the private property rights clause, effectively abolishing private property rights and enabling expropriation without compensation, state-sanctioned theft of land. They can take any land they want and they don't have to pay anything for it. That they put to Parliament, and then they failed to amend the Constitution because they didn't get enough support in Parliament. Why is that? Not because all the parties in Parliament united and said, we're going to protect private property rights. No, the radical left-wing parties in Parliament said that this expropriation without compensation does not go far enough. We want all land in South Africa to be in the hands of the state. All the land needs to be in the custodianship of the state. So they didn't vote with the ANC, which is a left-wing party, but the ultra-left said we need even more. We don't even just want the power to expropriate or take land. We want all that land to be in the hands of the government. So then that left-wing hubris, that left-wing arrogance saves private property rights for a brief moment. But AfriForum, the organization that I work for, and we can talk about the work that we do in a moment, warned at the time and said, these guys are going to come back. They tried this once. They want to abolish private property rights. And we were proven correct. A few weeks later, then Minister of Justice, Ronald Lamola, comes out, talks to the media, and he says, this attempt to make expropriation without compensation possible was just one way in which we could have tried. We are now going to use alternative ways to ensure we get expropriation without compensation made possible. One of these ways is the Expropriation Act, which has now been signed into law in 2025. So they use an alternative route, still get to the same point, where the state now has the power to expropriate private property without compensation, a serious threat to private property rights in South Africa. Now, here's where the distortions come in, where we have to get the truth really under a microscope. The government has not seized land en masse since signing this Expropriation Act. The threat comes in that they now have the power to seize land and with no compensation. That's what AfriForum and other organizations in civil society in South Africa are sounding the alarm about. So I think there are some lies out there, people saying that mass amounts of land has already been expropriated. That's not true, but the government now has the power to do that. Metaphorically, they have a gun in their hand. They haven't pulled the trigger yet.
It's actually quite an old trick, in my opinion, to do it that way, where you pass a law, you promise you're not going to
never use it.
Yeah, you promise that it's going to be, you're only going to use it in emergencies, only when you really need to. You can be trusted with this power. Honestly, I remember when George W. Bush, who's a Republican, and Republicans are supposed to be more freedom oriented. It was so long ago, it was 20 years ago. He signed a law that basically made illegal incandescent light bulbs. So banning incandescent light bulbs, which are God's gift to man. Like, I don't like Edison personally, but his light bulbs rule. So I knew right then, and it had like a 10 or 15-year lead time. And I remember saying, like, you people don't understand, it's happening now. Like, it's happening. Like, you don't care because it's Republican or whatever. And I did start stockpiling light bulbs, but now and people would laugh at me. There's too many of those light bulbs, will never run out. I have tons of them. And I had a friend come over the other day and like, oh my gosh, can I get some light bulbs? So, I mean, I'm not making fun. I'm not taking lightly the situation. I'm just saying
but it's exactly right. Why would you grant yourself a power that you will never use?
Yeah, they do it on purpose, and they do it just that way so that they can say, like this New York Times article I want to touch on later, which is just a bunch of claims that for me, if they had made any attempt to back up their claims, I would click through and I would look at the numbers and I would present that to you as counter arguments. They're just nebulous claims, which I will read out to you. But they get to say, I think the first one of the first lines in it is that not a single farm has been seized, but it says to this day no farms have been seized by the government. But the fact that they even write that as if that's something that should make you feel better makes you ask the question, if your selling point is that this law has not been implemented, why are you defending this law?
Yeah, but it's like, for example, if your government told you we're amending the Constitution that you lose your freedom of speech, but nobody has been arrested yet. Nobody has been arrested for speech.
Talking. See what happens. Well, no big deal, right?
Yeah, I mean, why are you worried? Nobody's been arrested. You're like, yes, but why did you amend the Constitution? Why did you take out the right to freedom of speech?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, and that's happening now. I actually think that Elon Musk, who is not an Afrikaner, but he is from South Africa, is actually in our government right now people are saying he's shrinking the size of government, he's reducing spending. Absolutely not. Our budget, the budget that the Trump administration put forward, is not smaller in any way than the current budget. And he's just firing all the people. So obviously, to me, he's inserting some automation, which people would want to think through, but they're doing it in a way that it's not stimulating on the ground real conversations, because the impact is off in the future.
Yeah, I just have to say the size of the American government kind of just blows my mind. I often struggle to conceive just how large and complex the American government is. So I don't know even where you'd start if you wanted to shrink it.
And here's the thing:
it's like an impossible task.
Yeah, no doubt. In my observation, the richest civilization that has ever existed. Yet we borrow from our children to live. So we run deficits and we keep taxes low, so that the reason they run deficits is that the taxpayer doesn't understand the real cost, the price of what we're getting. So they spend 45% of the productivity of the country. So say the country is whatever, $20 trillion, they spend $9 trillion, something like that. I can't remember.
Right.
But you only pay $7 trillion in taxes. So yes, and also appropriating land, nationalizing farms, that kind of thing, certainly in South America, does not work like that. What happens when you communize, make communist the factories and the land, is that the productivity plummets on those things every single time. And I believe that you have a history of that. There has been appropriation of some land or means of production.
Yeah, so that's I'll leave that to the expert that I interview in my documentary, Theo de Jager. He's the head of SAI, one of the largest farmer unions in South Africa. He actually details some of the cases where the state has attempted to expropriate property, and gives you some of the details regarding those cases in the documentary that we've mentioned. So I'd rather refer your audience to the expert there. So in regards to the rest of the conversation, I think we can go into some of those claims that you wanted to address, some of the, it's in fat quotation marks, fact checks. And then we can talk. I want to end on a positive note, so then we can talk about what my organization, AfriForum, does and what the future looks like.
Okay, that would be great. So it said, I'm going to read the first paragraph of this article. It's March 15th, 2025. So recently, it says Trump, this is the headline of the New York Times article, Trump tries to use white South Africans as a cautionary tale. It says the president and his allies accuse South Africa of discriminating against and killing white people, warn that it could happen in America if attempts to promote diversity aren't stopped. Okay, so here this is being used for this propaganda thing. We're going back and forth with DEI.
Such a blatant just twist of what's going on.
Yeah, and I don't even.
South Africa is just trying to promote diversity. By like instituting racially discriminatory laws. Wow.
Yes, like white people can't get certain jobs, right? Like so actually,
certain jobs are reserved for like BEE jobs, Black Economic Empowerment jobs. But that's the irony of all these laws. They have these beautiful names like redress and employment equity and Black Economic Empowerment, but they do exactly the opposite. They don't do anything that their title says they're going to do. Black Economic Empowerment policies in South Africa do everything but empower Black South Africans. They just create a new political elite. A new political class that is enriched through their connections to the government.
We have people don't know this at all, but we have the government jobs. A lot of them have those kind of clauses in there. They won't tell you, but so you just don't know why you didn't get the job, and you're like, oh, that's a really hard job to get. But they have quotas like that, which are almost exclusive, if not totally exclusive. So, but here is the nugget of what they're saying. To hear President
check the fact checkers.
Yes, exactly. To hear President Trump and some of his closest supporters tell it, South Africa is a terrible place for white people. They face discrimination, are sidelined from jobs, and live under the constant threat of violence or having their land stolen by a corrupt Black-led government that has left the country in disarray. But the data tell a different story. Although white people make up 7% of the country's population, they own at least half of South Africa's land. Police statistics do not show that they are any more vulnerable to violent crime than other people, and white South Africans are far better off than black people on virtually every marker of the economic scale. Now it says black
Right.
people. I don't know if it's black South
Let's
Africans.
let's unpack some of the claims there. That whole claim of like white South Africans own like that percentage keeps changing. Then it's 50%, then it's 60%, then it's 70%, then it's 110% of all the land in South Africa. That whole claim is just it's based on a government report from 2017 that's not worth the paper that it's printed on. It's a propaganda report or a propaganda statement to say, oh well, 70% of the land in South Africa is owned by white people. No, the state in South Africa is the largest single landowner in South Africa. There's no way to account for many of there's no way to account for the racial ownership of many of the land in South Africa. They used very flimsy methodology there. And then firstly, that 70% percentage that is thrown around is 70% of all farmland. And farmland is like is something like a very I can't remember the specific statistics now off the top of my head, but 70% of all the farmland of a private holding farmland leaves you at the end of the day, when you do all of the sums, with white people in South Africa owning somewhere between 20 and 25% of all land in South Africa. So the percentage comes down quite a bit. The largest single landowner in South Africa, as I said, is the government. The government in South Africa owns about 17 million hectares of land. And then there's also 8 million hectares of land that just are unaccounted for who owns it. But according to the experts, that 8 million hectares of land will be in state ownership as well, which leaves the government's total land ownership somewhere in the region of about a quarter of all the land not a quarter of all the land, about 25 million hectares of land in South Africa, which is a massive amount of land. But as I said, I think when it comes to specifically these statistics, it's almost impossible to condense them all into. You'll have to do the sums and get to the bottom of it. But the last time that I checked, the amount of farmland owned by the amount of farmland is what they're talking about when it comes to the 70%, and that 70% of all the farmland leaves you with about 20% of all the land in South Africa. That's not even talking about the land in trust ownership, in traditional authority ownership, in state ownership. The land question in South Africa is a lot more complex than that. There's actually a fantastic documentary that my colleague Ernst made called Disrupted Land. It's on YouTube. You can go watch it. It's about the facts surrounding the land debate in South Africa. So that's the first thing. The other one is they pretend like racially discriminatory laws in South Africa don't exist. They're like, allegedly, white South Africans are being discriminated against. Well, it's not exclusively white South Africans. Other minorities like colored South Africans and Indian South Africans also find themselves on the wrong side of these discriminatory laws, but predominantly in particular, it's white South Africans. And then these people making these claims need to explain why there's so many stories of, for example, what happened in 2018 when one of the largest pharmacy chains in South Africa, Dis-Chem, an internal memo leaked where the CEO wrote an internal memo where he said, we have to put a total freeze on the hiring and promotion of white people because we're not meeting the race quotas that the government put out, which means we are going to face massive fines by the government. That's public knowledge. You can find that leaked memo online. And then you have to ask yourself, what's going on there then if there's no racially discriminatory laws in South Africa? Another example would be when it comes to the state power company, Eskom. They've laid off hundreds of white workers at their company because they need to reach certain race targets. South Africa, and as I said, rather than just listing all the examples, you can go watch the documentary that I mentioned earlier. We go through all the examples of the most egregious racially discriminatory incidents in South Africa.
So the next paragraph says that these are South Africa's attempts to undo the injustices of apartheid. But if I understand correctly, the farmers, what they actually still, your politicians will still call them Boers, that's a different thing, right? Is appropriating farmland a remedy for apartheid? Like, how do you think about that from a justice point of view? Because they're saying they're implying that the farm is owned illegitimately. And it sounds to me like the history of the Boers was that they got that land through how we think of you get land, which is you mix your toil with the soil kind of thing.
But so how does the history of land ownership in South Africa is incredibly complex. At the end of the day, there were land dispossessions under the previous the apartheid regime in South Africa, but that's why a restitution process has been in place for decades, where if you bring evidence to this restitution process that you were dispossessed under the previous regime, you get your land back. Well, you get the option. You can either get your land back or you can get the cash value of your land back. The question there, the statistic that then really tells the story is that out of all of those successful land restitution processes that have happened, or successful land claims since 1998, 90% of land claimants prefer money rather than the land. So that also blows another narrative out of the water. But that restitution process has also been derailed by corruption and mismanagement and everything that goes with whatever the South African government touches. So there is a restitution process in place. AfriForum, my organization, supports that restitution process because it is based on the principle of fair and adequate compensation, not expropriation without compensation. A farmer is paid the value, the market value of his land. A willing buyer approaches a willing seller, and then that land is redistributed to people that made the successful land claim. So when it comes to particularly the righting the wrongs of the past, you don't correct a human rights violation in the past by committing a human rights violation in the present. That's very skewed logic. That's two wrongs don't make a right.
So they go on to say Tucker Carlson ran a segment describing land seizures and homicides in South Africa. Mr. Trump then tagged Carlson in a social media post in which he said he was ordering an investigation.
That's 2018, yeah.
He said into this farm seizures and the large-scale killing of farmers in South Africa. And then the New York Times adds, though to this day, no farms have been seized by the government. And then it goes on to say Mr. Posobiec, who I don't know, said South Africa, although I probably should know he is. Jack Posobiec is a far-right influencer, it says, was in shambles because of laws.
If New York Times calls him a far-right influencer, he's probably just
right down the middle.
He's probably just a normal guy.
Yeah. He said, it says South Africa is in shambles because of its laws meant to produce racial equity. What do you think about that?
Well, yes, the racially discriminatory laws in South Africa have had a disastrous effect. It just causes absolute chaos in the market. It makes it that, for example, here's a fact that your audience maybe doesn't know. Why do you think South Africa doesn't have Starlink?
Yeah, you'd think it would because it has problems with
all the other countries in Southern Africa have Starlink, and those that don't have it have a deadline when they will get it. South Africa is the only country that doesn't have Starlink and doesn't even have a deadline to get Starlink in Southern Africa. Why is that? Rhetorical question for your audience. Ruminate a little bit on that. Because Starlink, or the parent company SpaceX, does not meet the racial criteria that they need to operate in South Africa as a foreign company. So they have to give away a certain percentage of their company to black shareholders in South Africa, or black people in South Africa, employ a certain amount of black people in South Africa to qualify for race criteria in South Africa. That's why South Africa doesn't have Starlink.
Wow, is that for everything, like airlines and stuff like that?
Any international company that wants to come work or operate in South Africa, 30% has to go to black South Africans, and the black but other companies in South Africa, domestic companies, also are being have to reach race targets set by the government.
Do they have a cash option?
No, there's no cash option. You have to comply to the racial discrimination.
Yeah, it's ripe for corruption. He says,
yeah,
the New York
absolutely.
Times, it says that Mandela's party went to I believe it was the African National Congress, went to great lengths to embrace market-oriented policies that allowed white South Africans to maintain their economic power.
Well, they did in the first few years, and then gradually started just increasing their meddling in the economy and their manipulation of the economy and state intervention in the economy. I mean, that's another thing. We have rolling blackouts in South Africa. They've been going on since 2007. So let me do my math. That's about 18 years now that we've had rolling blackouts in South Africa. And that's because South Africa's electricity is provided by a single government monopoly that can't provide electricity efficiently to the entire population.
Because it's just incompetent.
It suffers from all the problems that a government monopoly suffers from, where there's no competition. They get away with any inefficiencies and problems and whatever they want because they have a total monopoly. They don't have to perform. Why? You don't have competition. You don't have anything to worry about.
Right. And it was one party. Here, they put this paragraph in here and they don't explain the implications of it. Is descended primarily from Dutch colonizers who arrived in southern Africa in 1652. Afrikaner people became international darlings in the early 1900s as a small tribe that stood up to the mighty British Empire in battles over territory, though they ultimately lost the war. The ruling British then looked down on Afrikaners as uncouth, and those fights sowed bitter divisions between South Africa's two largest populations that exist to this day. Is that true?
I wouldn't say the divisions exist to this day. I mean, I'm married to a half English woman, and that's not controversial at all. When it comes to particularly the English Afrikaner divide, that was a big divide in the 20th century, but in the 21st century, it's definitely not there. There's still an ideological divide to a large extent, and English white South Africans are economically a little bit better off than Afrikaners, but socially, there's not a lot of antagonism. I wouldn't say that cleavage is still there now.
Okay, I have two last things, and then let's talk about your organization and go positive. What that article also discusses Trump's offer that what I would say the farmers targeted for land removal have an open door to relocate to the United States. Yes. And that feels to me like it's playing into the hands of those who would like to get that land.
Well, at the end of the day, I think from AfriForum's side, what's important here is that, there's a lot of farmers and minorities in South Africa in general that have suffered due to these discriminatory laws, brutal farm attacks, chants about their murder. Our organization isn't going to shame anyone or attack anyone that takes up this offer from Donald Trump. I'm very glad that he has put that offer on the table for those that genuinely want to pursue it. But our mission as AfriForum that we'll talk about now is to build a future here at the southern tip of Africa. There's already a very large Afrikaner diaspora out there, and we will remain in contact with them and build stronger connections with them. But this refugee program, I think there are people out there that genuinely don't have a future in South Africa. Maybe they've been the victim of 2 or 3 attacks on their farm. Maybe they've lost everything. Maybe it's been the 5th, multiple job applications. They can't find a job due to racially discriminatory laws. I think those types of people, at some point, you give up, and I think there should be an option for them if they want to go to the US. I do think the ANC, the South African government, would also benefit from the fact that there's then if a lot of farmers leave, that then there's a lot of land to grab. But that's a bit more speculative in regards to what the future might hold.
I was going to ask you about the South Africa it's almost like they have their own kind of intelligence thing that reaches out into the rest of the world. I've read a lot about the assassination of Olaf Palme. South Africa's brought into that. Elon Musk is a very fishy character, in my opinion. he's South African. Hunter Biden's wife, he
There's a
married
lot of
after.
South African connections all across the world. Yeah, it's a
Psyops,
fascinating
but,
place.
yeah.
It's
It's like military intelligence kind of stuff. But I know you only you have your focus, and I'm not going to derail you with that. But it feels to me like there's so much more deep state backstory to South Africa, probably primarily during the apartheid era.
Well,
So
I would indulge a little bit by saying that South Africa has for a long time been the testing ground for many policies that are then later exported to other countries. I mean, if Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, then South Africa is definitely the laboratory of empires. The whole statue toppling phenomenon started in South Africa and then was exported to the United States. So you're welcome. I say that very morbidly.
In the Middle East,
So it came here from the students toppling statues that are that symbolize racism and oppression or whatever. That started here with the Rhodes Must Fall movement, and then that was exported to the United States.
Well, that's interesting that you would say that then, because I have an interesting book here by a Cuban guy who says that what happened in Cuba was intentional deindustrialization of the most advanced Latin American country as a kind of prototype experiment for, if you do believe in global conspiracies and that there is a movement by a global elite to restructure the world in one way or another. And some do say that deindustrialization is one way to get the West in sync with the East enough to have a world government. You can't have a world government that's very lopsided. It kind of has to be something that you can control in similar ways, or that it's easier to control people who don't have a lot of wealth and independence. I think that was kind of Otto von Bismarck told the Kaiser that and introduced the welfare state to kind of bleed people dry and give it back to them later. So there's a lot of things that could be coming out of the prototype that South Africa seems to be following, which is take the most prosperous country in Africa, which obviously apartheid is unjust. You can't have that. But actually see what happens when you do a kind of leave it alone to its own devices.
My friend Russell Lamberti has a word for it. He calls it South Africa being the world's leading de-developing country.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I think that is probably something that may be in the plans for those who plan. So it is interesting, actually, to us. We should probably pay a little more attention to how it goes, and if you guys can actually make a difference. So what's your plan? Tell me about your organization and what your hopes are, both your goals and your activities.
So I represent an organization called AfriForum, which is the largest civil rights organization on the African continent and also the largest community-based solutions organization. And civil rights, you have to understand here in the context of a minority, specifically in a country where there are racially discriminatory laws, there are chants about murdering people based on their identity, government overreach in all facets of society almost. So we fight for the constitutional rights of South Africans in general, but also primarily we represent we fight for the rights of minority groups in South Africa, in particular the Afrikaners. So how do we know AfriForum is the largest civil rights organization in Africa? Well, we've got 315,000 donating confirmed members, which means that on a membership base, there's no other organization in Africa that has that many donating members. It's not as like you're just liking a Facebook page and then you become an AfriForum member. You actually have to be actively donating, supporting our cause in that way to be a member. Your audience, you can become, we've now created the opportunity that people abroad can also become members. I'll give you a link if anyone wants to support us. But what we're doing is what we call state proofing. So that's our community-based solutions component. So what's happened since 1994? Well, you've had chronic government capacity collapse, where the government wants all these responsibilities, but they increasingly can't deliver those responsibilities like electricity, responsibilities like fighting crime, responsibilities like maintaining infrastructure. So AfriForum does a lot of that. We have over 170 branches all across the country, and those branches organize their communities to start addressing the problems that the government should be fixing but is not fixing. So here's some examples. We fill thousands of potholes all across the country. We plant trees, we clean up rivers. We have a massive neighborhood watch network all across the country, over 175 neighborhood watches that fight back against crime, that ensure that their communities are safe, and work very closely with local police, because the local police are completely overwhelmed by what they are facing in the crime wave or the crime problem in South Africa. And this is not your grandma's neighborhood watch that's just walking around with pepper spray and a flashlight. These are well-equipped, well-trained, disciplined communities that are very serious about keeping their community safe. And we're increasingly broadening that network. It functions on about 11,000 volunteers that are not being paid. They're doing it because they want to and they have to keep their community safe, because the government is failing to keep them safe against crime.
Are there gun laws that can they
very strict gun laws? South Africa has incredibly strict gun laws. It's incredibly difficult to get a legal firearm in South Africa. It's very easy to get an illegal firearm in South Africa.
Really?
That's the irony.
Sounds
it's
right.
very, very difficult to get a legal firearm.
The government has guns.
Yes. So that may be for you Americans, there's a little bit of a case study there. No, incredibly strict gun laws does not diminish crime. It actually helps crime flourish.
Of course,
South Africa is the perfect case study. But our community watchers are, as I said, well equipped. A lot of them have their legal firearms by their side, and they keep their community safe. So that's the context within which AfriForum started as an organization. A context of government failure, a context of a void being created where the government was doing something and then just lost the capacity to do it. And then communities had two choices. They could either sit back and say, well, and complain about the government, but the government should be solving this problem. Well, newsflash, they're not going to be solving this problem. So now you can either keep complaining or you can get off your backside and start doing something about it. And that's what AfriForum's philosophy is. We're creating state-proof communities, state-proof in the sense that, firstly, when they're threatened by government overreach and destructive laws, they are able to have an immune system against it, that they can shield themselves against it, but then also that they can shield themselves against state decay, against the country de-developing, as we mentioned earlier. So that's AfriForum. And then AfriForum is part of a larger solidarity movement, which is a network of over 50 organizations that all specialize in different aspects to ensure a future for Afrikaners at the southern tip of Africa. So there's many different organizations there, but I work for AfriForum that specializes in community organization and civil rights. The civil rights side also comes in with court cases. We have had a lot of successful court cases fighting for people's constitutional rights, like freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so forth.
It's interesting that you have something effective on the community level. It will definitely, I mean, I think I can see the possibility of it being a very useful prototype, because we have these, in my opinion, totally orchestrated from the top for their purposes. Things like defund the police, where I don't even care about police. I think what you're doing could be totally effective. I think just everybody being armed would be very effective, but it's not like that. We're not prepared for that. We have gun laws in a lot of places as well. So we may come to where we need to have that situation. There was a crazy thing that happened in New York. New York's super busy as people get killed, pedestrians. It's like pedestrians and cars mushed together. And it's so it's illegal to cross the street, not at the stop. They rescinded that law because minorities were getting more tickets because they crossed the street. I guess I don't know if they crossed the jaywalk more or what, but they literally decided as a government to sacrifice the lives of these people because they thought the laws felt discriminatory. So I just feel like that's it's an inversion of the protection element of government. I'm a libertarian. I don't care about the protection of government. I just would be happy to protect myself. But I'm just saying, these inversions do happen here, not as extreme as yours, but it's good to
I
know
hope that
there's a
I hope that
prototype.
our state-proof solutions here in South Africa can serve as a valuable blueprint for you there in America. I
Yeah.
think America is going to be, unfortunately, I think unfortunately what I see in America's future is a lot of South Africanization in many aspects.
Yeah. I wonder, can you, so I'm going to put all the links in the show notes. What is
Sure.
the URL for AfriForum if people want to just look at that?
So if they want more information, they can go to AfriForum's website, which is www.afriforum.co.za. I will put that link in your private chat now, so you can put it in the show notes. But then also there is the website that will appear will be in Afrikaans, but it completely translates to English. You just click on the English button that's on the top right of the screen. If you're on mobile, you just go to the options and then you click on English. So everything will be there. You can read for the latest news. You just go to news and then press statements.
Yes, I was wondering about that. I think people, given that South Africa is in the news right now, there's a lot of propaganda and counter propaganda here. It would be nice for people to have a resource to go to read current events, news in English from your point of view. And that's on your website. That is a place to go for that. That's great. That's very helpful.
Right. And as I said, what we do is based on our membership model, and people abroad can now become members as well, or they can make one-off donations there, and I'll give you that link as well if they want to support state-proof solutions in South Africa. It is also, as I said, in America's interest because we're experimenting with all that, pioneering a lot of these solutions. So you can, in the end, learn from our mistakes. I mean, we've have many other breakthroughs as well. Last year we started our own private firefighting unit that's been incredibly successful. We have our own garbage removal service now that we're pioneering. We've bought a garbage truck, and when that's successful, we will roll it out to other cities as well. So those are all the services that the government should be doing, but they're not doing it effectively. Yeah. So
I personally experienced that.
Filling the void.
In my town, 9,000 houses burned down in January. And I would say it's extreme dereliction of duty. Everything from the electric company to the government, even the insurance companies, just absolutely dereliction of duty. We would have been better off if they had not, if they don't represent themselves as being in a position of protection. We would have been much better off. Back in the day, people used to clear the brush themselves. It's coming. It's coming. Whether it's race-based, I don't know, but it is coming that you are going to have to take care of yourself.
You're going to have to become more state-proof. That's going to be your future.
State-proof. I like it. I think I might have to use that.
You can keep it. It's not been patented, so you can use it.
Good. All right, I'm going to say goodbye, but I'd like you just to hang on to make sure the recording is uploaded.
Sure, no problem. And also, I would just like to encourage people again. If you want to learn more about South Africa and specifically the current environment, you can go watch that documentary. It's free on YouTube. It's called "Is Trump Right About South Africa?" It's on the AfriForum YouTube channel.
Yes, it was easy to find that. And I wonder if there's a book of South African history, if people want to go a little deeper and broader, that you could recommend.
So there's a few books that I can recommend. The one book is Kill the Boer by Ernst, which is a book on farm murders. Then there's all on South African history. You can read Thomas Pakenham's The Anglo-Boer War. Or the Boer War. That's a fantastic book. And then also The Afrikaner is a biography of a people by Herman Gilumeer is also a very good book.
Okay, I might have to get that from your side.
Yeah,
okay,
I'll send it to you.
Thank you so very much. It was so absolutely interesting to hear about the past and present in South Africa. And
it's a difficult job to condense this massive amounts of information into just a chat, but I hope I succeeded.
It was very helpful, and I know you put the effort in, and I appreciate that. Okay, so we'll hopefully talk to you again, and good luck to you, and just hang on. Thanks, everybody.